Markiplier's film adaptation of David Szymanski's short horror game Iron Lung honestly had no right to be as good as it was, and I applaud it for putting my snobbery in its place. Despite its egregious runtime that overstays its welcome by 30 minutes, what's presented is a remarkably faithful and even more so deeply earnest evolution of the original source material that sustains the enigmatic nature of its setting whilst doubling down on the terrifying cosmic horror at the heart of it all. For the uninitiated, Iron Lung tells the story of the Quiet Rapture, a cosmic cataclysm that causes every star and habitable planet in the universe to suddenly disappear, leaving behind only a handful of human colonies fighting for survival aboard starships and space stations that drift endlessly through the darkness. The film immediately drops us into the shoes of Simon, a convict who is offered his freedom in exchange for navigating a poorly engineered dilapidated submarine fittingly nicknamed the Iron Lung through a mysterious blood ocean that encompasses an entire alien moon. While Simon's initial goal is to discover some fleeting hope for humanity in terms of resources, it quickly becomes apparent that something profoundly monstrous lives deep within the blood ocean that's omnipotence far exceeds human comprehension. The story's obtuse nature might be burdensome for many, as you'll ultimately be left with more questions than answers, but I respect Markiplier's commitment to the mystique by only offering brief glimpses of what exists outside the confines of the sub, as the tragic circumstances of Simon's past faintly materialize as he experiences the horrors that lie beyond the veil. As always, if you have your own thoughts, theories, opinions, and even corrections, please leave them with me in the comments below, as well as any requests for future videos. And of course, you know the drill at this point, brace yourself. Now, on the topic of blood oceans and poor engineering, if there's one thing in life I've had a bad relationship with, it's shaving, because most times I find myself with immense skin irritation and awkward cuts due to over-designed multi-blade razors that often just put me off clean shaving completely. However, as my wedding was approaching, so came the need to find a razor that could undo my bad shaving habits and offer a simple, clean, and consistent solution without all the hassle and gimmicks. That's why this video is sponsored by Henson Shaving, a single blade razor designed for pure precision thanks to its firm ergonomic build that angles the blade for a stable and efficient shave. It turns out the problem with multi-blades is that their flexibility means I have instinctively learned to overcompensate by adding pressure to get the cleanest shave, thus leading to hair tugging, uncomfortable friction on my skin, and just a bad experience overall. With Henson's no-nonsense razor combined with their Smooth Protect shave cream, I actually had the confidence to shave on the day of my wedding without worrying about all the usual irritating outcomes, allowing me to look and feel my very best and discover a newfound appreciation for self-grooming and self-care. If shaving with style and comfort is for you, simply go to hensonshaving.com/ryanhollinger and use my code ryanhollinger to get 100 free blades with the purchase of a razor, and let me know what you think. Now, firstly, as a major spoiler warning going forward, I did cover the original game by David Szymanski over a year ago, so I won't be regurgitating its contents too much here. However, I do have to spoil the payoff of what is effectively a glorified jump scare to compare how Markiplier adapts his version of events, so consider this your final lifeboat if you want to experience Iron Lung blindly for yourself. The film sets the stage with a surprisingly energized opening, as the sub is broodingly lowered into the blood ocean with a modest steampunk-esque epicness that combines a commanding rustic narration with a pulsating score. Although, I must admit, that energy is then unfortunately somewhat hindered with the first impressions of the sub's internal appearance, as it felt too clean and spacious in the early portions of the film to truly sell the intense, suffocating claustrophobia it's meant to evoke. I can respect that the film likely didn't have the biggest budget, but it does have that disproportionate sound studio set feel where I think even the digital look takes away a certain grainy quality that sells the gritty and oppressive isolation of a man exiled into the deep dark abyss. Now, to its credit, the editing does work very hard to elicit the intended response through some visually interesting close-ups framed around the debris and rigidness of the sub, while wider-eyed fly-on-the-wall shots add a lingering notion of sinister surveillance as Simon slowly succumbs to debilitating cabin fever. However, I can't deny there are times where it tries too hard to stay dynamic, especially during overly long stretches of tedium that, sure, are contextually fitting with Simon's increasing sense of displacement and encroaching paranoia, but often just seem like Markiplier is too afraid to cut things he went out of his way to shoot. Strangely though, I find myself enthralled by its tedium. It's hard to explain, but there was this constant sense of moderate overstimulation where the film is always trying to create the illusion that something is happening to keep the pressure itching away at you. Whether it be the binaural sounds outside the sub, the diversity of the shot selection, or simply the persistent jankiness of the sub itself, the overriding restlessness clicked with me far more than I expected it to. Now, in fairness, I did have lesser expectations going into Iron Lung, so this is most likely an under-promise, over-deliver type situation, combined with my soft spot for weird cosmic horror. Hell, I even said in my initial impressions I saw a bit of Duncan Jones' Moon, Robert Eggers' The Lighthouse, and Andrei Tarkovsky's Solaris because it does employ a fair few psychological and existential beats that gradually disorientate our understanding of time and space as Simon tackles an increasing emotional breakdown. Although that said, while I thought to compare it to those three works was a hefty compliment, people then started to point out to me that it's actually much closer to the broodingness of Event Horizon, and now since then, it's become a visual comparison I cannot unsee. In fact, it distinctly uses that influence early on to subvert expectations away from the game's events by showing a brief glimpse of something lurking inside the sub, later revealed to be a vision of the sub's previous convict, and thus going forward, nothing is ever what it seems. So, in the game, the player navigates the Iron Lung through various crevices to photograph specific coordinates that slowly reveal evidence of ancient alien life as you're stalked by a big, hideous, hungry fish that previously devoured another expedition. As oxygen dwindles and the sub malfunctions as blood seeps in, your urgency intensifies until you finally reach your last coordinate, to which the big-ass mutant fish breaches the sub and consumes you. The game abruptly ends with no answers, and instead solidifies the dire and desperate state of the universe, as your task is ultimately an expendable one-way journey, where upon discovering the remnants of the previous convict who piloted the ship, has left a message that coldly states, "This is not an expedition, it is an execution." It's at this point in the film where it chooses to devote much of its time to making Simon a conflicted but sympathetic character who is worthy of some form of redemption for the actions that have led to his execution, so to speak. In the game, if you sleuth through the sub's optional computer terminal, you can experience an encyclopedic lore dump that details how a coalition known as the Consolidation of Iron is attempting to unite the surviving colonies under the same ideal to safeguard mankind's future. However, one of the largest space stations entitled Eden rejects this unification in favour of independence, as they basically act as a cult who worship the last surviving trees that represent a glimmer of natural purity in a universe now wrapped in total darkness and soulless man-made mechanical infrastructure. Again, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of the game's lore, but this specific information is loosely fragmented across the film as it comes to light that Simon was born into Eden and later instrumental in an attack at one of the COI's territories known as Filament Station that resulted in the deaths of several dozen innocent people. While Simon claims this was an accident and is deeply distraught over the meaningless loss of life he indirectly caused, hell, the extent of his involvement is left to speculation, his execution is initially framed as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth type punishment until there's a legitimate chance chance to transform his redundant guinea pig status into a potential meaningful sacrifice. My favorite scene early in the film is when Simon briefly resurfaces, because it not only gives us a nice breather from the thalassophobic anxiety, but it specifically reinforces Simon's dejected and dehumanized status as a nameless convict literally sealed into an oceanic coffin as he struggles to see or hear any of the obscure happenings locked behind the blood-soaked window. It's a brilliant bit of visualization to show his inhumane exile, as Simon is branded as nothing more than a butcher to be forgotten, until over time he begins to develop some camaraderie with his superior Ava, who by the end finally starts to refer to Simon by his actual name. Caroline Kaplan's performance as Ava is actually one of the bigger highlights, because the gradual shifting tone of her voice reflects her softening empathy towards Simon, as he all but admits to being raised in complete disillusionment much like her, until he's able to find some tangible evidence of hope in the form of a data archive lost by the previous expedition. The way I see it, the delicate humanity that seeps through the cracks of the world's cold, harsh exterior is thoughtfully realized, because while the original game's ending compounds the bleak nihilistic circumstances of humanity drifting nebulously towards a faint illusion of a future, I feel Markiplier does lean into a more explicitly hopeful conclusion that reflects real-world sentiments. Look, I can understand people being at odds with Markiplier's borderline melodramatic writing at times, but speaking for my own sensibilities, I appreciate how the story seemed to reflect his own much-needed positive disposition on the world. I'm not all that familiar with Markiplier's work, besides watching a few Let's Plays from back in the day, but I certainly get, let's call it, a parasocial impression. He's a pretty emotionally transparent person who wants to put genuine good into the world, hence why I don't think the film is as harsh or as cynical as it could have been. Of course, obviously I'm not saying the film is a secretly genius metaphor for the digital dehumanization of today, but in my head, the story still indirectly reflects the sentiment of struggling for human connectivity in an age of isolation and uncertainty, as Simon regularly seeks comfort and reassurance from the faint disembodied voices of the intercom as he slowly self-destructs in his own confinement. When Simon discovers the data archive in the second half, the story begins to notably reinvigorate itself and give the characters newfound reason to fight for hope amidst the constant conflict and chaos humanity habitually spirals into during desperate times, reflected in the senseless destruction of Filament Station. Again, I'm not saying that's precisely what the story is doing, but it does fit with the current collective consciousness we see in a lot of recent horror movies. Just as a long-winded example, Backrooms evoked a similar quality with how it approached the anime and malaise intensified by the post-pandemic mindset, as lonely people seek clarity in nebulous spaces that reflect their abstract, disillusioned and unfocused state of mind in a world they feel increasingly disconnected from. Historically, this has often been the case when major global events inherently rest in our ever-changing perception of the world, and thus influence our feelings towards the stories and art that we produce. So with that said, I sincerely think those sentiments rest within Iron Lung, even if not intentionally so. Anyway, let's talk about the actual horror, because I really loved how they approached the X-ray photography that defined a huge factor of the game's dread. While I still would have preferred the entire visual style to embrace the analog format, the negative photography presents strong, visceral imagery akin to that of Savage Land, where it only gives you a piercing glimpse before it's gone, leaving you eager to see more. In the game, you could photograph various strange and startling discoveries endlessly until it becomes vividly clear that you're being stalked by a monstrous fish that puts the fear of God in you. However, the film significantly evolves the original design into an abomination of bone and organic matter, as if not a fully formed creature. It immensely benefits from taking the original basis of the game's photos and heavily leaning into a Lovecraftian eldritch anomaly that seeks to devour and absorb everything around it, thus explaining its abstract appearance, particularly after it precedes a nightmare of Simon awakening before an omnipotent cosmic eye, lulling him into surrendering to its power. The reveal of the fisheye in the game is iconic, yet I appreciate that the film went for something more otherworldly and magnificent to tap directly into the grander cataclysm at play, as this entity seeks to unify for its own survival, which ironically reflects what the consolidation of Iron strives for as well. It takes on the artistic qualities of Annihilation, Still Wakes the Deep, and even a little bit of the Philadelphia experiment, where biomass, iron, steel, and consciousness become one organism, thus explaining why visions of the previous convict see him mutated beyond recognition. What in the game was once, and still is, an ambiguous deep-sea frog, eel, fish thing, is now an even more incomprehensible threat that makes Cthulhu look like expired fish food by comparison. The fact that the blood looks so thick and unnatural works to its effect, as once it starts seeping in, Simon and the sub gradually become mutated by it, with the wires and piping beginning to resemble veins and tendons. I truly did not expect it to become a straight up body horror by the end and relish in legitimately ghoulish imagery. Sure, one could say it's a little overindulgent, but I think it's better to go big or go home with this kind of maddening climax. Seeing Simon merge with the sub while he battles for a few extra moments of self-control so he can secure the data archive and send it to the surface is a brutal way to conclude without diminishing the modestly hopeful outcome, building on those initial skeletal images of the creature until we're left with a gargantuan monstrosity is a great ascending payoff, as Simon destroys himself, the iron lung, and the creature in an explosion that reversely echoes the devastation he caused to Filament Station. As the previous convict's letter implied, their freedom is found in death. But instead of Simon simply surrendering without a cause, he at least does something to give back to humanity to ensure there's a real reason to keep fighting for a future. To be honest, I think the critical discourse centered on Markiplier himself has definitely had a side effect on the reception, but I do think he well and truly holds his own as a first-time jack-of-all-trades filmmaker. In fact, there's even humility to how he gives credit and honor to David Szymanski before himself that shows how collaborative and appreciative he is of others' contributions to the film, that adds a further positive touch that makes me even more endeared to it. So with that said, until next time, stay safe, stay away from cosmic fish, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye. Nailed it. Jesus fuck. Okay. Oh, I just realized that the fucking mouse was in the... it's fine. It's fine. That got closer.